The day they showed up on our lawn, shouting about bloodlines and old maps, I remember thinking right then and there that there are fights you can see coming, and there are fights that arrive like thunder. We'd been standing on the porch with our coffee, the steam mixing with a thin ribbon of October breath, and a woman I'd never met before was telling my wife that our house belonged to her family. She said it with a kind of ownership in her voice that makes you itch, the way some people own a room just by the angle of their chin. That's how it begins. Someone else suddenly deciding your life is a mistake they can correct. We'd bought the little gray house 2 years earlier and turned the cracked linoleum into a kitchen where the light falls just right in the afternoon. My name's Evan Hayes, I'm 42, and my wife's Mara. We work regular jobs, have an old dog named Finn who thinks he's an alarm system, and we like planting things in the front bed in the spring. That life, honest and small, is the sort of life you assume can't be stolen with words. But it can. Words are the slow tools that people use first, and if words don't work, they turn to paper and then to courts and then to whatever gets in the way. The woman on our lawn called herself Lydia Caro. She had a coat that smelled faintly of cedar and a voice that seemed practiced for confrontation. She pointed at the house like she could see through the paint and the years, right into an older claim of ownership. She handed us a photocopied document and told us to leave. She told us the county records had a mistake we'd benefited from. She said, and I remember this because she said it with finality, "You ought to do the decent thing and let us have what's ours." The decent thing, apparently, for Lydia, was for people she'd never met to hand over the life they'd built. We laughed at first because what else do you do when someone demands your life back with the authority of a stranger? But the laughter is thin when they're serious. The paper she handed looked official in the way most frightening things do. Typed words, an emblem of some trust that I'd never heard of, a demand to vacate within 30 days. She said she had a trust, old deeds, and the right to reclaim. Behind her, 2 neighbors watched, more interested in the spectacle than the facts. A man drank coffee from his car window and nodded as though he'd been waiting for this kind of entertainment. Mara was quieter than I was that day. She kept her hands in her coat pockets and said, simply, "We bought this house fair and square." There's a specific kind of loneliness when you say something obvious and it's treated like a provocation. Lydia smiled like she'd been waiting for that. "Fair," she echoed. "Fair to move in on someone else's legacy." Then the phrase changed. It left the realm of property law and landed in theater. She called the county out by name. She used words like stolen and erased, and she held our attention like a hawk circling. That paper was the beginning of a legal storm. I remember the first night after she left, Mara sat at the kitchen table with the light on. The papers spread like leaves. We read them together. There were names, dates, signatures that almost looked right if you squinted at them, and a chain of ownership full of gaps. The document seemed to say that an entity, the Caro Trust, had superior claim. It looked like someone had dusted for fingerprints and missed the obvious, which is to say the kind of sloppy certainty you see in any small-town grift. We made a call to a lawyer the next morning, slower than panic but faster than hope. Lawyers are strange people for ordinary storms. They translate your life into a kind of currency that can be measured in hours and motions and filings. Our lawyer, a woman named Elise with a soft voice and a blunt pen, told us the paper could be filed as a quiet title action, a legal process aimed at clearing up ownership, or it could be a bluff. Either way, she said, you don't want them to win the court of public opinion while we're filling motions. That was when the small drama in front of our house turned into a public story. Lydia had posted a photo on the local board that same afternoon, a photo of the house with a red circle drawn around it like a target, with the words, "Results to follow" beneath. People started to choose sides. There's a kind of cruelty in small communities that's almost architectural. It's in the way sidewalks meet, in the way the grocery store bulletin board becomes a jury. Some of our neighbors stuck up signs in sympathy, "Stand with the Hayes." Others whispered as they passed, and one morning I found a flyer in our mailbox that simply read, "You don't belong." Violence escalates not always with fists, sometimes with social sanction. We learned to lock our doors. Finn learned to bark more often. The legal grind is where time becomes heavy. Days are measured in filings and hearings. Months in retainer fees and invoices that arrive like small curses. We hired Elise because she had a way of treating the truth like a stubborn patient. She believed in evidence the way other people believe in prayers. She suggested an immediate motion to dismiss the Caro Trust's claim and to require proof of standing. That meant we needed more than our purchase agreement and the county records. We needed to show the court why the Caro Trust's timeline didn't add up and why Lydia's story had gaps. Elise wanted to pull the threads, and there's nothing like the law for revealing how messy human stories really are. While Elise dug into public records and old deeds, Lydia turned to spectacle. She organized a small rally that drew a crowd of people carrying signs about heritage and accountability. She gave interviews to the local public access station, speaking in soft, righteous tones about the need to correct an injustice. When someone in a courthouse press room asks for a clear villain in a story, the villain often shows up with a microphone and a prepared statement. Lydia knew how to craft herself as the aggrieved party, and the camera loves someone who plays the part with conviction. I'll tell you, the strain of watching your life be litigated in coffee shops and online comment threads wears you down in ways I didn't expect. Mara would stand at the sink and stare out the window at the magnolia tree and say, "Do you remember when we painted the blue bedroom?" Like memories are talismans against accusations. That interior life, the small rituals that make a home, yours became our defense in the quiet hours. We both carried the sense that our house was more than a deed. It was history, laughter, scratched floors, and Sunday breakfasts. But the law doesn't care for pancakes. The law cares for paper. The momentum shifted for a moment when we found something in the walls. It was almost accidental, a plaster seam that didn't match the pattern, a square that gave under my thumb like a secret door. I was trying to fix a crooked baseboard, and my hand found old nails and the smell of pages. When we pried it open, there was a small metal box, the kind that felt like something a grandfather would tuck away. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a few things that looked like they belonged in a museum. An original deed signed in ink that had dried into a brown river, a stack of letters in looping handwriting, and most of all, a small leather-bound journal with a name stamped on the cover in faded gold, Thomas L. Mercer. If the world were kinder to coincidences, we'd have found that box earlier or later, but not then. The journal was a private thing, the kind of record someone makes that they don't plan to share. The first entry was dated 1912 and spoke about building the house with his own hands, about planting the magnolia, about the sound of the river nearby. That journal felt like a lungful of air after months of smoke. It didn't disprove Lydia's narrative on its own, but it gave us a thread to hold. It gave us names and dates that didn't line up with the trust she claimed to represent. It gave us a person who had lived in and loved the house in a way we could show the court. We took the box to Elise like pilgrims bringing a relic. The next period was a sequence of experts and validation. Paleographers, people who read handwriting as others read fingerprints, examined the deed. A local historian confirmed that the Mercer family appeared in town records for decades. A genealogist traced descendants. The court likes facts that can be tied with threads. We had evidence now that suggested the deed Lydia presented was either erroneous, misattributed, or in the calmer phrasing of legal affidavits, suspicious. How do you prepare to face someone who has already staged the narrative? We rehearsed testimony in our living room. Elise would sit across from Mara and me with a legal pad and ask, "Where were you on this date? And who else was present?" We practiced not sounding desperate, which is harder than it looks. Drama loves desperation, and we wanted to hold a steady cadence because the truth, when told calmly, is harder to dismiss. When the preliminary hearing arrived, the courtroom smelled of coffee and old wood. Lydia sat in the front row with a woman who looked like she'd read a book titled How to Look Indignant in 30 Easy Steps. At some point, Lydia caught my eye and held it like a coin, not aggressive, but certain. Her smile was small and practiced, the kind people use when they're trying to own the moral high ground. In the courtroom, people speak slowly and deliberately, as if their words could be preserved by the plaster. The judge was a man with a voice like gravel. He asked for exhibits, for chain of title, for proof beyond a reasonable doubt of ownership. Elise presented our box carefully, like a witness who knows that one tear in the fabric will ruin her argument. She placed Mercer's journal on the table and asked the court to note the date, the handwriting, the references to the magnolia, and the builder's tools. I still remember the sound of the judge's pen hitting a pad when he called for a forensic analysis. Under oath, Lydia claimed ancestry and trust rights, and when pressed about the chain of custody for her documents, her answers started to fray thin threads at the neckline. The judge didn't slam a gavel in dramatic fashion, but there was a moment when the room exhaled, that tiny pause before something shifts. Outside the courthouse, the commentary expanded. People who'd taken sides were suddenly impressed by the romance of a journal. Others dug in deeper for Lydia. The thing about public opinion is you can't win it all, and you certainly can't buy it with paper. There were podcasts and an op-ed that argued, in earnest, about how local histories are often erased and how that could be happening again. There were also comments anonymous and cruel that wondered why we couldn't just move. They were missing the point. Leaving felt like erasing ourselves, and some things your home, the person you became in a place are not bargaining chips. Lydia did not go quietly. After the court inquiry, she pared back her rhetoric and filed a series of motions that complicated matters: discovery requests, depositions, and the kind of procedural tactics that chew months out of your life. She also did something that made my stomach drop. Someone anonymously filed a complaint alleging we had built an unauthorized structure, a claim so thin it should have been laughed out of the clerk's office. But it required an inspection and consumed time. I don't know if Lydia authorized it directly. Small towns have ways of moving in packs when they smell a scent of righteousness on the wind. The pressure of months of legal attrition is more than financial, it's an erosion of certainty. Nights began to take on a particular weight. I woke up with the names of statutes in my mouth, and Mara began to write things down as if to remember who we had been before the fight. And still, between depositions and threats, there were mornings when the sunlight through the kitchen window made the floorboards glow, and I would think, with a stubborn simplicity, that the house was ours because it felt like ours. That visceral feeling is a kind of testimony, but courts ask for receipts. Then, in a move that felt both reckless and necessary, Elise suggested an aggressive tactic: public disclosure. If Lydia had mounted a campaign of public sympathy, we would counter with the human story behind our walls. We released an essay to the local paper, an account of how we'd found the box, how the journal had changed our understanding of the house, how this place had become our home in the ordinary ways that matter most. It was risky. It invited more attention. But it also let the people who'd been watching the house as something to gossip about see there were faces and a life behind the paint. The response wasn't uniformly kind. A neighbor I'd known for a decade stopped by and told Mara she was overly dramatic. Someone else brought us a pie and a note that said, "Stay strong." The town lined up its opinions like syrup on pancakes, some sweet, some bitter. Our essay, however, did something crucial: it humanized us in a way a deed could not. People began to ask questions. At a town meeting, someone stood up and said she remembered Thomas Mercer as a quiet man with a laugh like a bell. Small memories aggregated into a weight of reality that you can't easily fake. Still, the battle moved back into the courtroom. The big day, the injunction hearing, felt like the place where all the threads would either knot or fall apart. We sat on the bench and watched Lydia's counsel breeze through documents and affidavits like a bluff that hoped for success through repetition. Elise, meanwhile, was methodical. She had lined up experts: the paleographer who confirmed ink composition and paper age, a historian who could place the Mercer family in local records, and the genealogist who had traced living relatives. She called them one by one, and each witness added a layer to our case until the stack felt like a scaffold of truth. When the leather-bound journal was placed on the stand, I felt a hum of something like electricity, not because I believed in theatrics, but because this small book had traveled through decades to land in our hands at the right moment. Elise asked the historian about the language used in the journal, about the references to local landmarks that no one else would have known. The historian nodded and then, with a warm exactness, said, "These are details you don't invent." It's a mundane kind of testimony, but sometimes the mundane is unstoppable. Lydia's counsel tried to poke holes. He asked about handwriting variation, about the possibility of forgery. The paleographer, a woman with a cool tone and precise eyes, explained the ink analysis and why certain patterns suggested continuity rather than composition. Lydia took the stand eventually, and there's nothing like a person's performance under oath to reveal fissures. She spoke with a calmness that was less conviction and more calculation, the kind of practiced stillness that suggests someone has rehearsed grief. Elise questioned her about the trust. "Where is the original trust document?" she asked. Who signed it? Where was it recorded? Lydia stumbled. It's with the trustees, she said, and that was all. Elise asked if the trustees could be produced. Lydia had an answer that kept receding like a tide. The judge, who had been patient in a way only someone used to human dramas could be, began to look less like a passive arbiter and more like someone preparing to weigh scales. The turning point came when a quiet man in a second-row seat stood up, an elderly man I'd seen only occasionally at the diner. He introduced himself as Walter Mercer, a descendant of Thomas L. Mercer. He had the hush of someone who'd lived long enough to know the difference between saying nothing and saying something. Walter's voice cracked. He said, "My grandmother used to tell me stories about this house. She said Thomas could fix anything and that the magnolia was planted the year I was born." It was small testimony. It was not a legal blow, but it made the room tilt. The human testimony landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples reached everyone present. After the hearing, the judge reserved a decision, and when it came, it was not a thunderclap but a reasoned dismissal of the Caro Trust's motion for immediate possession. The judge required Lydia to produce the original trust documents or risk sanctions. In layman's terms, she had to go home and justify her claims in a more concrete way than a photocopy. The judge's ruling didn't erase the months of strain, but it bought us time, and sometimes time is the only kind of victory you can realistically hope for. That night, we sat on the porch with a bottle of cheap wine and let silence fill the spaces where argument had lived for months. Mara traced the grain of the railing with her thumb and said, "We won't keep sleeping forever, will we?" It was a joke, a little attempt at normalcy. It landed with relief and a kind of sad humor. Our relief was savory, like stew after cold weather. We knew there would be more fights. People with grudges rarely stop at a single loss. They adapt. Lydia didn't disappear. She filed appeals, and while the dramatic court scene slowed down, people in town changed the way they looked at us. Some were kinder, others were colder. The Caro Trust supporters held meetings and pored over records, sure they'd eventually uncover a gap that would let them in. We felt like rabbits in a brush fire, safe for the moment, but aware that embers could find us again. What followed was quieter warfare. Inspectors arrived to measure things and to make sure our home complied with zoning regulations. There were whispers, anonymous calls to the bank, and, once, a smashed mailbox that felt personal rather than petty. The pattern is familiar. When people can't win through facts, they try for attrition. They try to drown you in small tasks until you either break or leave. It is an unromantic, but very effective, tactic. We also began to think bigger than defense. Elise suggested registering Thomas Mercer's journal and deed with historical societies and local museums, not to be melodramatic, but to anchor the truth in multiple places. We started a modest online archive where we posted transcriptions and scanned copies. There's a democratizing power in making things public. When history is locked in a private box, it can be manipulated. When it is shared, it is harder to twist. The archive was small at first, a handful of folks who read it and shared it, but it grew. People began to send us memories, small slips of family history, photographs. The house became less an isolated thing and more a node in a living memory. And then came the smaller satisfactions. Neighbors bringing casseroles, a teacher from the elementary school asking to bring her class by for a history lesson, an article in a regional magazine that treated the Mercer story with dignity. We had stumbled into something larger than ourselves, a reckoning with how easily local histories can be overwritten if no one pays attention. There's a moral complexity to the whole thing. While Lydia's theatrics had been performative, there were real people in town who felt a genuine grievance about the past. We had to keep reminding ourselves and remind the community that restoration of history doesn't require dispossession of the living. Justice, we insisted, should repair, not replace. Still, I won't pretend everything ended neatly. Lydia eventually produced documents that were, on their face, persuasive to a person who dislikes digging. They had signatures and stamps, but the more closely they were examined, the more inconsistencies appeared. Elise filed motions for sanctions on the basis of forged documents. The procedural slog continued, but the tenor had changed. The narrative that had once belonged to Lydia was weakening because archives, witnesses, and public memory had formed a counterweight. There was a moment towards the end, in a quiet courtroom after months of back and forth, when Lydia confronted Mara in a hallway. It was a small, cinematic confrontation, the sort of scene people remember because it feels raw and unedited. Lydia's voice was low and sharp. She said, "You stole our story." Mara's reply was measured. "We found a box in our wall. We found a book. We told the truth." Lydia sneered about legacy and entitlement. Mara answered with the names of the people who had lived in the house, reading them slowly like an incantation. Thomas, Eleanor, Walter's grandmother. There are encounters like that reveal character. Lydia's need to be seen as the aggrieved, and Mara's steadiness in the face of performative hurt. The hallway had the quality of a stage, and the truth the quality of a light. In the months that followed, a mediator suggested a resolution, a collaborative historical plaque that acknowledged both the Mercer family's long residence and other histories in the area, and a community fund to support preservation projects in the town. It was not a dramatic, cinematic ending in the way movies love. It was messy, bureaucratic, compromise-tinged. But compromise is an underrated form of justice when it prevents erasure and preserves living communities. Lydia accepted some terms, resisted others. She did not shake our hands. People who wanted a black-and-white movie would be disappointed. Real life tends to prefer gray. Now when I walk through the house, when I run a hand over the banister and feel the roughness worn smooth by generations, I think about what home means and about who gets to tell the story of a place. The Mercer Journal sits in an archival box on a shelf, digitized and available for anyone to read. There's a small brass plaque near the porch steps. It lists the names and the years, but it also has, stitched into the bottom line, an acknowledgement of failed systems that allow histories to be misattributed and a plea to the community to watch their past with care. We learned more than I thought a house could teach us. We learned that neighbors can be allies or enemies, often in the same week. We learned that a legal system, while imperfect, can be a place where evidence holds sway, and also that courts are not theaters of moral clarity, but forums where the messy human stuff gets translated into code. Mara changed through the process. There is a quiet edge to her now, not anger, but a kind of settled vigilance. You can see it in how she answers the phone, in the way she plans the garden beds now with a kind of strategic calm. I think the ordeal taught her something about boundaries and about not assuming that goodwill is a shield. I, too, changed. I stopped believing that neighborliness is a default condition, but I also stopped believing cynically that people are always hostile. People are capable of both small cruelties and vast kindnesses, sometimes in the same breath. This story is not meant to be a manifesto against anyone. It's complicated. Lydia had a grievance she believed was true, and she believed her actions were justified. Whether she was malicious or simply convinced of her rectitude, I can't tile that up neatly. What matters is that we as communities take care of our histories. Let them be documented, accessible, and respected, and let us be careful when we use the language of restitution as a tool for dispossession. If there's a single image that stays with me, it's simple and stubborn. Mara and me on the porch, Finn's head on my lap, the magnolia dropping small stars onto our yard. In the end, that small human scene, not the court transcripts, not the press, felt like proof of something. Not of legal possession necessarily, but of belonging that is earned day by living in a place, by painting the fence, by remembering birthdays, by planting bulbs that will be somebody else's one day. I tell you this because I know people watch stories like ours and think, that could be me. Maybe it could. Maybe you'll find a neighbor with a louder voice and an older paper, or you'll encounter an institution that mistakes a photocopy for a legacy. If you do, take heart. Truth can be stubborn when it's tended. We still see Lydia now and then at town events, and we nod, awkwardly, the way people do when they share the same small world. She has not become a cartoon villain, and I'm not casting her out. There is too much complexity for that. But I also won't romanticize the strain it's put on us. There are scars, invisible in the way you carry your keys, but they're there. They remind you to be a better neighbor, and also to be careful about who gets to rewrite history. If you took anything from this, please let it be this. History matters as much as the present does, and the present is fragile. When you hear someone telling a story about a place they claim is theirs, listen, but listen with care. Ask for proof, yes, but also look for witnesses. Ask after the small, ordinary things that make a home, not the loud claims. Because sometimes the loud claim is covering for something that wants to be true, and sometimes the quiet life is what deserves protection. And if you have your own story about a property fight, a reclaimed history, a moment where truth felt precarious, tell it in the comments. Tell us what justice looks like to you. Tell us how neighbors should act when history and homes collide.